Before their reunion, both Ellie and Jake had undergone significant life changes. Ellie had dedicated years to her career, but never truly found a deep, lasting connection in her relationships. Jake, on the other hand, had lost his wife, Samantha, and struggled deeply with the aftermath. These experiences caused them both to reassess their futures, wondering if it was too late for something new. Their families had always been close. Ellie had long admired Jake from a distance, but after her sister passed, she began spending more time with him. What started as emotional support soon blossomed into a deeper, unexpected bond. Neither of them had anticipated this, but the connection felt unique and comforting. As they drove toward Jake's house, they reflected on the changes in their relationship. Returning to the past was no longer an option, and neither of them wanted to. Ellie was eager to embrace the future, while Jake was more cautious, though just as invested. The only remaining question was when to share their new relationship with others. "Come on in," Jake said as they pulled into the driveway. "The boys aren't home, so we can relax and talk." "I'm Detective Sergeant Nathan Meyer, and this is Detective Carter," said one of the officers. "We're here to talk about your wife's disappearance on April 23rd. Jake responded, "I thought I'd already covered everything with the Coast Guard." "There have been some new developments since then," Meyer said. "Like what?" Jake asked, clearly confused. "How would you describe your relationship with your wife, Mr. Miller?" Meyer asked. "It was great. We've been married 18 years with no problems, at least not until the accident," Jake answered. "No marital issues before that?" Meyer pressed. "No," Jake replied firmly. "What's going on here?" "Do you know a man named Aaron Whitaker?" Meyer inquired. "Should I?" Jake responded, puzzled. "He's a senior accountant at your wife's company. Are you sure you don't know him?" Meyer asked again. "I'm sure. I never knew her co-workers. She reported to Louis Fournier, not Whitaker. It was strictly business." Meyer leaned back, eyes never leaving Jake. "We received an anonymous tip suggesting your wife and Mr. Whitaker were having an affair. You didn't know about this?" Meyer added. Jake looked stunned. "I don't believe it. How does this relate to her disappearance?" Meyer continued. "We've spoken to people at her office. Several suspected something between her and Whitaker. They didn't interact much, but the rumors were there." Jake shot back, accusing them of relying on gossip. But Meyer didn't back down. "We interviewed Whitaker too, and after some pressure, he admitted they were involved." Jake was visibly shaken. "I had no idea," he muttered. "Why would she do this?" Meyer stayed silent as Jake processed the information. After a long pause, Jake asked, "Why are the RCMP involved?" Carter answered, "There's a possibility this could be a suspicious end of life. Maybe you found out about the affair and acted in a fit of rage." "That's ridiculous." Jake shot back angrily. "I didn't know about any affair, and I'm no killer." "That's what many husbands say," Carter replied calmly. "Sometimes anger takes over, and things go horribly wrong." "Am I a suspect?" Jake asked, now defensive. "Not at this time," Meyer replied smoothly. "We just need to go over the facts again for our records, separate from the Coast Guard report." Jake sat in uncomfortable silence, the detectives watching him intently. Finally, he spoke. "Okay, one more time. But from now on, if you need to talk to me, my lawyer will be here." "Got it." "That's fine," Carter said. Jake began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "We were in the Southern Straits race, like we had been for the past 6 years. The weather was supposed to be rough, but nothing like what we ended up dealing with. My boat has radar and GPS, and Samantha and I had plenty of experience, so I wasn't worried. We took 4-hour shifts at the helm. I was on from midnight to 4 a.m. while Samantha slept. I had coffee and energy bars to stay awake. The storm got worse after my shift started, and the radar showed it was going to be much worse than expected. I put on my survival suit and left Samantha's at the bottom of the companionway, in case she needed to come on deck. Everything was fine until just before 2 a.m., when I started feeling sick, cramps, like food poisoning. It got worse, so I hit the alarm to wake Samantha. She came up, suited up, and took over. I went below to the head, and it took a while because I had diarrhea. I heard a noise on deck, probably something loose, but I knew Samantha wouldn't leave the helm, so I cleaned up and got ready to return. When I got back, she was gone. I turned on the deck light and called for her, but there was no answer. How long were you gone? Meyer asked. Maybe 15 or 20 minutes, no more, Jake replied. Continue, the detective urged. The boat was on self-steering, which we usually avoid in bad weather. The noise I heard was from the inflatable. An oar had come loose. I checked below, thinking maybe she was in another cabin or the head, but she wasn't there. It took me a few minutes to realize she'd gone overboard. I dropped the sails, started the engine, and circled back using the GPS. I called her name and turned on the deck light, but deep down, I knew it was hopeless. I made a distress call to the Coast Guard, and they have the recording. I kept searching, but the waves were too rough. The Coast Guard arrived around 4 a.m., but by then, I knew she was gone. Even with her survival gear, the water was too cold. I lost her. Her body's never been found? Carter asked, already knowing the answer. Jake shook his head sadly. No. Anything else that might help clear this up? Meyer asked, pressing for more. I'm just as confused as you about the affair, Jake said, frustration in his voice. I don't think it has anything to do with her disappearance. Carter wasn't deterred. As I said, an angry husband might seek revenge. If she was planning to leave you, maybe you knew a divorce would cost you half of everything, including your business. Jake's temper flared. How many times do I have to say it? I didn't know about the affair. It was an accident, a horrible accident. The detectives exchanged looks. Was he telling the truth? They had no proof to suggest otherwise, but the timing of Samantha's disappearance was troubling. That's all for now, Mr. Miller, Meyer said. Let us know if you plan to leave town. This case isn't closed yet, Carter added. Jake stood, his anger palpable. Next time, I'll have my lawyer. I won't be your scapegoat while you try to make 2 and 2 equal 5. He stormed out, but the door clicked shut softly due to the pneumatic closer. Meyer turned to Carter. What do you think? It's hard to say. It all depends on whether he knew about the affair, Carter replied. Yeah, Meyer nodded. That's the key. 3 months had passed since Jake lost Samantha, and his life had been filled with grief and turmoil. The initial shock was followed by the painful revelation of her affair with a coworker, Whitaker. Jake understood the police's suspicion. If he had known about the affair, he might have had a motive. But instead of mourning, he now had to deal with the fallout. Samantha's parents were devastated, especially her mother, who seemed to blame Jake. The tension grew between them, with her becoming more distant. The only real support Jake had was from Samantha's younger sister, Ellie. Once a teenager with a crush on Jake, Ellie had grown into a successful, independent woman running her own interior design business. Jake's mother, already devastated by the loss of Jake's father during a business trip to China, accepted Samantha's death as an accident. She focused on supporting Jake and her grandsons, Alex and Ben, who were coping better than Jake. Alex was preoccupied with getting an academic scholarship, while Ben was planning to join the family business. Jake hadn't told them about the affair or the police questioning. After a small memorial, a plaque was placed near Samantha's parents' home. Her father appreciated the gesture, but her mother remained cold toward Jake, showing affection only to her grandsons. Ellie often visited Jake, encouraging him to get back on the water, but Jake hadn't touched the linchpin lady since the accident. When Jake suggested selling the boat, both Ellie and the boys opposed the idea, so it stayed docked and used. Jake found comfort in his work at Millerpin Plastics, which specialized in pet containers for industries like pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. His father had steered the company away from the saturated beverage market, and Jake had continued that strategy, keeping the business thriving. Jake worked closely with his old college friend, Ryan Taylor, now the sales manager. They were in sync both professionally and personally, often socializing outside of work. Despite not returning to his sailboat, Jake still found solace at the yacht club, particularly in the dining room and bar. His father had been Commodore, and Jake had been expected to follow, but Samantha's death had delayed that. Still, he enjoyed the club, often bringing his sons for dinner. One Friday in July, after a long week, Jake stopped by the club. He'd invited both his sons, but only Alex showed up, along with Ellie. "Hi, Dad. Hope you don't mind Aunt Ellie joining us since Ben couldn't make it, Alex said. Can you tell your son not to call me Aunt Ellie? It's making me feel old, Ellie joked. Alex, respect your aunt's wishes, Jake replied with a grin. So, I should just call her Ellie? Alex asked. Sure, or babe, or hot stuff, Jake teased, causing laughter. It was the first time in months that he genuinely laughed. Don't you dare, Ellie said with a playful poke. You can call me Ellie or Miss Fairley, depending on the occasion. Alex shrugged and smiled at his dad. They shared a rare light-hearted moment. The dining room was hosting seafood night, and each of them ordered something different. The food, as always, was excellent. The mood stayed light until the dessert tray came around. Ellie and Jake passed, but Alex ordered a massive New York cheesecake. The waiter quickly brought 3 forks, clearly expecting them to share. I really need to stop eating here, Jake joked, leaning back. I'm going to hit 300 pounds soon. Nonsense, Ellie replied. You still look great, just like when you dated my sister. Ooh, someone's got the hots for Dad, Alex teased. Careful, Jake warned. This is family, not one of your teenage chats. Relax, Jake, Ellie chuckled. Alex didn't mean anything by it, right, Alex? Yeah, sorry, Dad, Alex said, looking apologetic. I'm not upset, Jake said softly, giving Ellie a brief glance. But some topics aren't for public or private talk. Party pooper, Ellie teased. Don't lead my son astray. I'm trying to raise him to be a gentleman. Good luck with that, Ellie laughed, and Alex joined in. As coffee was served, Alex asked, Dad, can you give Ellie a ride home? I've got a date in half an hour. Sure, Jake replied, smiling. Have a good time. After Alex left, Ellie turned to Jake. You've raised 2 great boys, Jake. You must be really proud. I am, Jake said quietly, but Samantha deserves a lot of the credit. She guided them. They'll be out of the house soon, though. What will you do then? Ellie asked. I don't know, Jake said with a sigh. Maybe downsize or live on the boat. You haven't been on the boat since the accident, right? Ellie asked. No, Jake replied, his voice quiet. I just can't get excited about it. The boys would love to go out with you. So would I. I love that boat as much as you do. She paused. I don't want to go alone, Ellie. I'm not ready. You don't have to go alone. I can crew with you. I know the boat well, Ellie offered, her voice soft. Jake hesitated, feeling the conversation moving faster than expected. Maybe I should take her out. She's been sitting there for months. That's the Jake I know, Ellie smiled. Why not check her out tonight? If everything's good, we could make a weekend of it. Jake raised an eyebrow. Can I trust you to behave? Ellie grinned. Of course. Alex was right, she added, her tone light but serious. I've had a thing for you since I was 14. Jake chuckled. I knew that, but I never took advantage. And after that? Ellie asked, eyes on her cup. I was married. I took those vows seriously. I can tell, Ellie said quietly. Let's go check the boat. Jake broke the silence. Yes, let's, Ellie agreed. They walked to the dock, and Jake opened the gate for her. As she passed, she brushed against him, not by accident. Jake watched her head toward Linchpin Lady, his mind racing. Ellie had never married, saying she hadn't found the right man. Samantha used to tease her about not looking hard enough. Meanwhile, Ellie had built a successful interior design business, starting at 27. By 33, she was well established. Samantha had always been tall and slim, a serious, put-together accountant who'd stayed home with the twins until they were 13, then returned to work. She didn't socialize much, preferring a quiet, introverted life. In contrast, Ellie was shorter, Kavya, with a lively personality. Jake had always found her attractive, even wishing at times that Samantha had a bit of Ellie's spark. But he had been content in his marriage, never acting on his feelings. Now, at 40, he was starting to feel like he was too young to give up on life. And if he pursued a new partner, he'd be more selective. Jake was a handsome man, 6 feet tall, dark brown hair, with a tan from years of sailing. He worked out regularly, and his natural smile and dark brown eyes had always made him stand out. Many women had envied Samantha for having such a successful, personable husband. He checked over the linchpin lady. Everything was in order. The maintenance team had emptied the freshwater tanks, and the fuel was nearly full. The batteries and systems worked fine, and he left instructions to refill the water. The next morning, he'd just need to grab food and drinks. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he thought about Ellie. It felt strange to consider dating his late wife's sister, even though it wasn't wrong. Ellie had grown up since her awkward teenage years, and the thought of taking her out on the boat felt natural. He left a note for Alex and Ben, inviting them for the weekend, then packed a bag. Despite his reluctance, he was looking forward to being back on the water. The next morning, Jake was startled awake by the doorbell at 7 a.m. groggily. He threw on jeans and answered the door to find Ellie, beaming and ready for the day. "What are you doing here this early?" he groaned. "The sun's up. Let's go," she chirped. "Come in. I need to get ready. Make some coffee." "Sure. And don't forget your overnight bag." "I've got it packed," Jake said. 15 minutes later, he was showered and dressed, carrying his bag. The boys were still asleep, likely from a late night. Ellie held up his note to them, smirking. "Looks like it's just you and me for the weekend." Jake smiled faintly. "We need groceries." "Nope," she replied proudly. "I took care of it last night." "Good. When's high tide?" "Just about now," she said, ensuring they'd have an easy exit from the marina. Ellie drove them to the yacht club, chatting along the way while Jake sipped his coffee. They loaded the supplies and bags onto the boat under the cool morning sun. Ellie expertly untied the lines, and Jake carefully navigated the boat out of the marina using the bow thruster. The diesel engine hummed as they headed toward the open waters of Georgia Strait. There wasn't much wind, but they didn't have a set destination. Jake kept the motor running, scanning for a breeze. "Where do you want to go?" he asked as they stood together in the cockpit. "Somewhere sunny, warm, and private," Ellie replied with a satisfied look. Jake grinned, fully aware of her intentions. He'd known about her attraction to him for years, though it had always been awkward when she was younger. Now, with both of them single, things felt different. After Samantha's death, Ellie had started checking in on him regularly, helping with the boys and handling household tasks while managing her own business. Jake didn't mind. Ellie's positive energy was a welcome relief after everything that had happened. Jake still couldn't fully accept Samantha's infidelity, even though the evidence was clear. It was hard to believe that his wife had been unfaithful. But as the detectives had said, people knew, and they talked. Sleeping alone felt strange, especially when Samantha's scent had faded from the sheets. The two of them had rarely been apart, traveling together for trade shows in places like Chicago and Dusseldorf. But now, the thought of moving forward, maybe with Ellie, didn't feel as wrong as he had imagined. Jake had no choice but to accept the facts. Samantha was gone, and the affair had changed everything. The mystery of her disappearance still lingered, but the truth was clear. She had been unfaithful. He had to accept it, painful as it was. "A penny for your thoughts?" Ellie's voice cut through his thoughts. Jake gave her a tired smile. "Just reminiscing," he said, though the truth was more complicated. Grief, guilt, and confusion all weighed on him. "You need to stop grieving," Ellie said gently. "Your sons, even my parents, have accepted it. You've got years ahead of you that could be happy if you let them." Jake nodded, but his heart wasn't fully convinced. "I suppose you're right. Is that what this weekend is about?" "Exactly," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "You're still young. What happened wasn't your fault. It's time to move on. And you know I'm here to help." He smiled faintly. "You've been a great support, Ellie. I don't know if I've said it enough, but having you around has been a big help." Ellie gave him a warm hug. "Anytime, Jake." "Where are we headed?" she asked as they pulled away. "I thought we could go to Saturna, maybe anchor at Winter Cove," Jake said, trying to sound more confident. "Perfect," Ellie agreed, her voice upbeat. "Great, take the helm, and I'll get us some coffee in Danish." Jake made his way below deck, feeling the weight of everything he'd been through. The linchpin lady, once a symbol of family joy, had become a painful reminder of everything he'd lost. But now, as he stood on deck again, he couldn't deny that the water had a calming effect. Maybe this weekend would help him heal. The wind picked up, and Ellie took the helm expertly. She had always been good at it. The two of them worked well together, and Jake found himself relaxing for the first time in months. They sailed further into the strait, toward the Gulf Islands. The boat's engine hummed, and Ellie steered them with ease. "I'm glad you suggested this," Jake said after a while. "I needed to get away from everything." "I know," Ellie replied, glancing at him with understanding. "It's good to get out of your head sometimes, even just for a little while." "Yeah," Jake said, though his mind was still clouded with thoughts of Samantha. "It's hard. Everything reminds me of her." Ellie's tone softened. "I get that, but you've got to let go of the grief. For your son's sake, too. They need you to be there for them." Jake winced, but nodded. She was right. He couldn't stay stuck in the past. He needed to find a way to move forward, for himself and his children. By late afternoon, they reached Winter Cove on Satuna Island. It was quiet, with no other boats around. Perfect. Jake anchored the linchpin lady carefully, signaling to Ellie to drop the anchor. "What's for dinner?" Jake asked, ready to relax. "Pork and beans on a paper plate?" Ellie teased, though she was clearly enjoying the chance to joke. Jake laughed. "You're kidding. What did you really bring?" "A variety of cold cuts, cheese, coleslaw, fresh rolls, and lemon tarts," she said with a grin. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Sounds healthy." "You can't survive on pork and beans alone," she replied. "And I brought wine." Jake chuckled. "Do you still have that Spanish Red Castillo something?" "Yep. Want to start with a Beaujolais?" "Sure. I'll handle dinner while you set up the table." They ate in the back of the cockpit, enjoying the warmth of the evening. Jake opened the Beaujolais, then the Spanish Red, letting it breathe. They clinked glasses, savoring the quiet and the delicious food. "I'm glad you decided to do this," Ellie said after a while. "Go sailing?" "Yes, and invite me along," Jake teased. "Wasn't it your idea?" "Would you have gone without me?" she asked with a smile. Jake paused before admitting, "No, probably not." "Any regrets?" she asked, her voice sincere. Jake smiled faintly. "None." They ate in comfortable silence, soaking in the serenity of the cove. After a while, Ellie spoke again. "Jake, do you know the 5 stages of grief?" Jake looked at her, surprised. "Yeah, vaguely. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right?" "Exactly," she said. "Where do you think you are?" Jake thought for a moment before replying, "I haven't really thought about it. There's no denying Samantha's gone. I was angry. I blamed myself. Depression hit hard, but I think I'm working through it. The pain is still there, though." "So, are you nearing acceptance?" she asked softly. Jake shook his head. "It's more complicated than that," he said, his voice heavy. "There are things I found out that change everything." Ellie's expression shifted from confusion to realization. "She cheated on you, didn't she?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. Jake was taken aback by how quickly she guessed. He nodded, his gaze darkening. "Yeah." "How did you find out?" she asked, furious on his behalf. Jake hesitated, then spoke quietly. "The RCMP interviewed me about the accident. They mentioned a senior manager at Samantha's office. I didn't know him, but they hinted at an affair. Eventually, the guy admitted it. It had been going on for months." Ellie's shock was palpable. "How could she do this to you?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. Jake shook his head slowly. "I had no idea." "She was selfish," Ellie said, her voice full of disbelief. "You didn't deserve that." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't know how to move on from that." Ellie's expression softened. "You will. It'll take time, but you'll get there." Jake nodded slowly. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew he had to try. For his sons. For himself. And maybe, just maybe, for the chance of something new. The police had even questioned whether Jake had known about Samantha's affair and had done something to her. Jake had always tried to block those thoughts, but they kept resurfacing. Ellie sat silently, processing the new information. After a long pause, she asked, "Is that why it's been so hard for you to move on?" Jake nodded. "Yes. Not only did I lose her, but I can't understand why she betrayed me, the boys, all of us." Ellie sighed. "My sister was always selfish. We never got along growing up. Maybe she resented me for being the younger child who got a lot of attention. But when you came along, I saw how she schemed. You were a catch, handsome, smart, set to inherit your dad's business. Jake listened quietly, half smiling at her dark humor. She knew exactly what she was doing. Ellie chuckled softly. I was helpless back then, too young, too awkward. But you always treated me well. You were my Prince Charming, even though I knew I'd lose you to my sister. I cried myself to sleep, wishing I was older, prettier. Jake was surprised. You waited for me? Of course I did, Ellie said, meeting his eyes. Every guy I dated was compared to you, and none of them measured up. Jake leaned back, stunned. You waited 20 years for your sister to mess up? Ellie nodded. Futile, I know. Samantha had you, and everything she wanted. You gave her everything. New cars, vacations, a big house, and she took you for granted. Jake's heart sank. I never knew. I thought I was just giving her what she deserved for being a good wife and mother. Samantha was selfish, Ellie said, shaking her head. When she had everything, she still wanted more. I knew she'd mess up someday. Jake was quiet. You really didn't think much of her, did you? Part of it was jealousy, Ellie admitted. She had you. But mostly it's anger now, knowing how she betrayed you. And now she's gone. Jake looked away. And I'm still here, not knowing what to do with myself. Ellie reached over and gently touched his arm. I get it. It's too soon to think about the future. Jake sighed deeply. I am attracted to you, but everything I believed about my marriage is falling apart, and it's messing with me. I might need therapy to sort this out. Therapy? Ellie asked, surprised. Really? Maybe. I need to get my life back together. For the boys, for the business, for myself. Ellie hugged him tightly. I'm sorry, Jake. I didn't mean to dump all this on you now. I had no idea what my sister had done, but I'll give you space. I've waited this long. I can wait longer. Jake held her close, unsure of his feelings. Was it love, or just confusion? He wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. They finished the wine in silence, sitting apart but not distant. The stars began to appear overhead, and Jake found himself thinking about the satellites orbiting above, watching from a distance. The stillness of the cove was only interrupted by the occasional jet flying from Vancouver. As the night settled, they buttoned up the cockpit and went below deck. Jake slept in the forward stateroom, and Ellie chose one of the aft guest rooms. The boat could sleep 7, though it had rarely been full in recent years. Usually just Jake, Samantha, the boys, and sometimes Ellie. Jake woke early on Sunday as light streamed into the cabin. Knowing he wouldn't fall back asleep, he grabbed some fresh clothes and headed to the forward head for a quick shower and shave. When he emerged, Ellie was already in the galley, wearing a sheer dressing gown and making coffee. Morning, Jake greeted her, smiling. Hey, did you sleep well? Yeah. You? Okay, Ellie admitted. But we did talk about some heavy stuff last night. I didn't mean to burden you with that. No, I'm glad you told me. It's something I needed to know. Jake couldn't help but notice how the gown clung to her figure, and a familiar attraction stirred inside him. While he'd seen her in bikinis before, this felt different. With Samantha gone, his inhibitions were slipping. He poured himself a bowl of cereal, knowing Ellie wouldn't want a big breakfast. She soon disappeared into the shower while Jake ate, his mind still racing through the events of the last few days. Grief had shifted to a strange sense of freedom, especially after learning about Samantha's affair. He realized for the first time that he was free to pursue other women, like Ellie. When Ellie returned, dressed in snug shorts and a tank top, Jake joked, "Are you going to be warm enough in that?" "I'll layer up if I need to," she teased. "Besides, it's easy to take off layers." Jake chuckled as they prepared to pull anchor. His attitude had shifted so much in the past month. Samantha's betrayal had severed his emotional ties, but he was still figuring out how long he should wait before moving on. Was he worrying about what others, Ellie's parents, his mother, even the RCMP, might think? Or was it time to focus on his own happiness? They motored out of the cove, heading through Active Pass and into Georgia Strait, enjoying the calm morning. The water was peaceful, with only a few boats on the horizon. Jake and Ellie sailed into the quiet, each lost in their own thoughts but sharing the moment in an unspoken understanding. Jake and Ellie decided to raise sail, despite the light wind, hoping it would pick up later. As they set course, Jake asked, "Can you take the day off tomorrow?" "I could, especially since I've got my phone with me." "I'm thinking of playing hooky," she replied. "Good idea. I'll let the office know I won't be in either. We can find a place to stay and get a good meal." "Nanaimo?" Ellie suggested. "Perfect. There's a great pub by the harbor." Ellie grinned. "I won't need to dress up for that." "You look good in anything," Jake replied with a smile. "Why, thank you. So, what are you saying, Mr. Miller? That I'm gorgeous and any guy would dream of being with me?" Jake laughed. "You know better than that." Ellie teased. "So what don't you find appealing about me?" Jake, still smiling, scowled. "Ellie, how did I end up in this conversation?" Her tone shifted to something more serious, yet playful. "Well, Jake, I've been patient, but now I'm going to be persistent. You have no excuse to resist me." Jake studied her, sensing the mix of seriousness and fun. He was caught off guard by how open she was. "Aren't we rushing things?" he asked after a pause. "No," Ellie said firmly. "We don't have to broadcast our relationship. I've waited 20 years, Jake. I'm 33, and my clock's ticking. I want you, and I want a child with you. Can I make it any clearer?" Jake was stunned. He had never heard her express herself so directly, especially about wanting a child with him. He wasn't sure how to respond. "You've made it clear," he said finally. "What do you expect me to say?" She grinned. "You're supposed to tell me you've had feelings for me for 15 years and can't wait to get me into bed." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is that all?" "One step at a time," she laughed. Jake turned away, staring out at the horizon, processing her boldness. After a while, he broke the tension. "How exactly does one go about screwing someone's brains out?" Ellie burst into laughter, and Jake smiled, the tension evaporating. She walked over, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him deeply. "If you let me, I'll show you," she whispered. Jake smiled, pulling her into another kiss. "I'll look forward to it." "Mean it?" she asked, still unsure. "Are you taking back your offer?" he teased. "Never. You're mine, Jake Miller. I won't let you go." Jake believed her completely. "What are you thinking now?" "I'm wondering how you're so sure. I don't want to disappoint you." Ellie smiled slyly. "Samantha used to brag about you after a drink or two." Jake's mood shifted, and Ellie noticed immediately. "Are you embarrassed by what she might have said?" "Yeah," Jake admitted. "I didn't think she'd share those things." "She was more likely to tell me than anyone else," Ellie reassured him. "But let's not dwell on that. She's gone, and I'm here. I want to help you forget the bad and focus on the good." Jake nodded. "That's all I can hope for." "I'll show you how good life can be," she said, smiling. They spent the rest of the afternoon sailing into Nanaimo Harbor. By the time they arrived, Jake had mentally surrendered to the idea of moving forward with Ellie. She had pushed him to make a decision, jump or walk away, and he had chosen to jump. Later, after a light-hearted pub dinner, they walked hand in hand back to the dock. Jake's lingering doubts made him quiet. He had made a commitment to Ellie, but he wasn't sure what kind of commitment it was. Was it just about sex, or did she see it as something deeper? "You're awfully quiet," Ellie said. "Second thoughts?" "Maybe," Jake admitted. "I feel guilty, like I'm cheating on Samantha. I know it's crazy, but it's there, nagging at me." Ellie stopped, her expression softening. "I won't push you into anything you're not ready for. I know what I want, but not at any cost. I'll give you time to decide when or if you're ready." Jake smiled at her. "Thanks. You're special, and I do love you. I'm just not sure what kind of love that is yet." Ellie smiled back, patient. "I'll wait." They boarded the boat, went below to the lounge, and Jake poured them each a brandy. They sat in silence, distracted by a PBS special on TV, using it as a diversion until bedtime. Jake kissed Ellie goodnight and headed to the forward stateroom. Ellie stayed behind for a moment, thinking about how close she had come to getting Jake to commit. But he hadn't yet, and she knew better than to push further that night. She could wait, but she wondered how much longer she could. Jake lay awake, replaying his conversation with Ellie. He was torn between his feelings for her and the lingering hurt from Samantha's betrayal. Despite trying to view her infidelity as closure, the image of his once perfect marriage still haunted him. After hours of lying awake, Jake got up. He noticed Ellie's door was closed and the lights were out. Grabbing a beer, he plugged in his headphones, letting soft rock soothe him. Eventually, he dozed off. His dreams were vivid. Ellie crying, Samantha's scent lingering, and a soft kiss that startled him awake. When he opened his eyes, Ellie was kneeling in front of him, smiling. "Drank yourself to sleep?" she asked, holding up the beer bottle. "What time is it?" Jake asked, rubbing his eyes. "About 2, Ellie replied. "Couldn't sleep either." "You were dreaming pretty intensely," she added. "You were talking in your sleep." Jake shrugged, still groggy. "Samantha never mentioned that." "You were crying in my dream," Ellie said gently. Jake hesitated, then admitted, "I didn't want to hurt you in the dream." Ellie, still kneeling with her arms on his thighs, looked up at him. "You care for me, don't you?" "I do," Jake said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just trying to figure out if it's more than that." After a long pause, Jake finally looked into her eyes. "Ellie, will you stay with me tonight?" She nodded, leading him to his stateroom. Jake knew this was the moment Ellie had been waiting for. The next morning, Jake woke with Ellie's body pressed against him. He glanced at the clock. It was past 8. His mind wandered back to the previous night and the dream. What did it all mean? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He had made love to Ellie, and it felt right. Ellie stirred and smiled. "You're awake?" Jake nodded. "I was thinking about last night. I wanted it to be perfect for you." "It was," she replied, yawning. "I've never felt so good." Jake smiled. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing." "I can't do that." Ellie grinned. "Did you really think I'd be okay with just one night?" Jake sighed. "I don't know. My head's a mess." Ellie wrapped her arm around him, pulling him closer. "I'll make it better, Jake. I promise." "I believe you," he said softly. As Ellie stood behind him, her arms around his waist, steering the boat toward House Sound, Jake felt the wind shift, speeding up their journey. The quiet Monday morning was a far cry from the chaos of the past few months. He could feel things were changing between them. What had started as a surprise had evolved into real love, far beyond what Ellie had expected. Making love with Jake had confirmed everything she dreamed of for years. Now, being with him felt like a dream come true. When they reached Fisherman's Cove, the tide made docking easier. Ellie quickly tied off the boat, and they silently loaded their gear onto a cart. The drive back to Jake's house was quiet, both lost in thoughts about how much had changed. Their relationship was different now, and there was no going back. Neither wanted to return to the way things were. Once they arrived at Jake's house, he invited Ellie in, knowing the boys wouldn't be home. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Torres, greeted them, surprised by their early return. They made their way to the deck with glasses of wine to talk privately. After some hesitation, Jake asked, "So, what's next? Is it too soon to tell the boys or our parents?" Ellie thought for a moment. "Probably. I don't feel the need to rush into telling anyone yet. We're still getting used to this ourselves. There's so much we don't know about each other." Jake smiled. "What happened to full speed ahead?" She laughed softly. "I'm not having second thoughts. I've waited too long for this. I just don't want to hurt anyone, especially our parents. They might think we're moving too fast." "What about the boys?" Jake asked. Ellie smiled. "I think they might already suspect something. I feel comfortable around them, and I think they're comfortable with me." Jake paused, then nodded. "Yeah, they probably already know." After a quiet moment, Ellie reached for his hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. They both remained quiet, reflecting on everything that had changed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Torres watched them from the kitchen window, smiling. By the end of the afternoon, they agreed to keep their relationship private for a while longer. Jake doubted they could keep it secret for long, but they were willing to try. For a while, things went smoothly. August was hot and dry, and Jake and Ellie spent every weekend sailing on the boat. The boys, uninterested, always found reasons not to join, which gave Jake and Ellie the privacy they craved. When the boys returned to school, little changed for Jake. He was glad they'd be home most nights. The chaos following Samantha's death had overshadowed the months from April to June. During the summer, life for Jake seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Alex was preparing for his scholarship exams while spending time with his girlfriend, and Ben was working at Millerpin Plastics. Jake, on the other hand, was focused on his work but found himself thinking of Ellie every day. Their weekends together were something he looked forward to, and as time passed, he became more certain of his feelings for her. Thoughts of Samantha, once all-consuming, gradually faded. His dreams of her stopped, and Ellie began to fill the space she had once occupied. Jake realized that he rarely thought about Samantha anymore, a sign that he was moving on, despite the lingering shadows of their past. But on September 1st, his past came knocking. He received a call from Elijah Brooks, the family lawyer. "Hello, Jake. It's been a while. How are you?" Elijah's voice was familiar, but something in his tone made Jake uneasy. "I'm fine," Jake responded. "What's going on?" "I wanted to ask why you haven't come in to discuss Samantha's will. I probably should have called sooner, but there didn't seem to be any rush." Jake's stomach tightened. "Her will? I hadn't thought about it. She's still missing, presumed dead." "True, but we can still review the will, just not act on it yet. Let's set up a time to go over it and tie up a few loose ends from her estate." Jake agreed to meet Elijah on Friday before noon. At lunch, they caught up. Jake shared how he'd been spending time with Ellie and how she had helped him start to move on after Samantha's disappearance. They talked about the boys. Alex and Ben were doing well, despite the challenges they'd faced. But then, Elijah turned serious. "Jake, did you know Samantha added something to her will just 2 weeks before she disappeared?" Jake blinked. "No, I didn't." "What kind of addition?" he asked. "She left a sealed letter for you. The contents of the will didn't change, but this letter was added. Since you already have a copy of the will, you can read it now if you'd like." Jake was taken aback. "And this was just before the accident?" "Yes. March 29th, just under 3 weeks before she disappeared." Jake was confused. He didn't know what to make of it, but agreed to read it. "Let's go back to your office." They returned to Elijah's office, where Elijah asked his secretary not to interrupt. The room was quiet as he carefully retrieved the letter from the file. "You probably have a copy of the will at home or in a safe deposit box?" Elijah asked. "Yes," Jake answered, already dreading what he might learn from the letter. Elijah nodded. "This is the last piece." Jake took the letter, his fingers trembling as he sliced open the envelope. Inside were several pages of Samantha's neat handwriting, and his stomach tightened as he began to read. "My dearest Jake," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, but I need to explain why." Jake's breath caught. "Earlier this year, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The prognosis was grim. I made the decision not to undergo treatment. I didn't want to suffer through chemotherapy or the pity of others. I chose to let it run its course." Jake froze. Samantha had kept this from him. Her diagnosis, her pain, everything. "But that's not all," the letter continued. "Not long before I was diagnosed, I began an affair. I wanted something forbidden, something to feel alive again. It was selfish and reckless. I thought it would end quickly, but it didn't. Comparing him to you, I see how much I've hurt you." Jake could barely read on. His chest tightened with betrayal. "Please don't share this with our boys or my family," Samantha wrote. "When the autopsy is done, they'll know about my illness. But Jake, you need to move on. Constance has loved you from the start. With her, you will find true happiness." Jake's eyes blurred as tears filled them. The pain of her confession was overwhelming. His mind swirled with images of Samantha, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had loved and lost. The letter dropped from his hands, and Jake sat back in his chair, stunned. He didn't know how long he sat there, trying to process everything. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he said, wiping his eyes quickly. Elijah entered, his face concerned. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked gently. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The letter, it's a confession. Samantha had terminal cancer. She planned to end her life on her own terms. But there's more. More. Elijah leaned in, his curiosity piqued. Jake handed him the letter, and Elijah read it in silence. When he finished, he sat back in his chair, shaking his head. I never would have imagined. This is a lot to take in, Jake. Jake swallowed hard. But there's something else. 2 months after Samantha disappeared, the RCMP called me in. Elijah's eyebrows shot up. What happened? Jake looked at him gravely. They found something I need to know. Jake learned of Samantha's affair when the RCMP questioned him about it. The officers had asked if he knew the man she was involved with, and when Jake said no, they told him the man had confessed and implied that Jake might have had a motive for harming Samantha. I denied everything, of course, Jake said, still shocked by the encounter. They let me go, and I haven't heard from them since. Elijah, concerned, replied, You should have called me. That puts you in a dangerous position. I didn't think they'd accuse me of anything, Jake admitted. They sometimes build a case slowly, Jake. You need to act now, Elijah said, his tone firm. We should go to the RCMP and present this letter. The letter, Elijah explained, could help prove that Samantha had planned her own death due to her illness, which would weaken any suspicion against Jake. Jake agreed, eager to put the matter behind him. Elijah arranged a meeting with RCMP officers Meyer and Carter at their headquarters. Jake and Elijah presented the letter, along with a sample of Samantha's handwriting. After reviewing it, the officers were convinced Samantha had planned her own end-of-life decision, driven by her illness. They assured Jake that the case would likely be closed soon. Elijah promised to petition for an official end-of-life certificate, though there wasn't much left in Samantha's estate. Mostly her clothes, jewelry, and car. The jewelry would be kept for Jake's son's future wives, except for a diamond pendant Samantha had left specifically to Ellie, a piece she had always admired. In a strange way, the letter gave Jake closure. He understood why Samantha had made the choices she did, even if he wished she'd given him the chance to say goodbye. As for her affair, it would remain a secret between him, the police, Elijah, and Ellie. He didn't want it to tarnish her memory. When Jake got home, he immediately called Ellie. Can I come over? I have something to show you, he asked. Of course, Jake. When will you be here? I'll be there in about half an hour, he replied. I'll let Mrs. Torres know I'm out for the evening. I'll have something ready for us, Ellie responded warmly. True to his word, Jake arrived at Ellie's townhouse half an hour later. As he walked up to the door, it swung open before he could knock, revealing a smiling Ellie. Hi, lover, she greeted, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him deeply. Hi, he replied when she finally let him go. They sat together on the sofa, exchanging more kisses before Jake placed the cream-colored envelope on the coffee table. What's that? Ellie asked, her curiosity piqued. I met with Elijah today, Jake said, his voice serious. Samantha left this letter with her will to be opened after her end of life. She gave it to him just before she disappeared. You should read it. Ellie nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jake handed her the letter and poured 2 glasses of wine while she read. When he returned, he saw tears running down her face. She finished the letter, set it down, and hugged him tightly. I had no idea, Ellie whispered. She hid everything so well. I know, Jake said, his heart heavy. She fooled all of us. It explains what happened that night on the lady. Ellie wiped away her tears. My poor sister. Hiding her illness. She really was a great actress. After a moment, Ellie spoke again, her voice trembling. And now I need to be careful. Cancer runs in families. Jake hadn't thought about that before. I hadn't considered it, he admitted. Ellie paused, then added, Jake, we can never tell my parents about this. Not about the affair or the self-destruction. It would destroy them. I agree, Jake said, his voice firm. I won't tell the boys or my mom either. They don't need to know. I'll put the letter in the safe deposit box. If you'd rather I destroy it, I can. I don't know, Ellie replied, her voice shaking. Let's just put it away for now and decide later. Jake nodded. Okay, I'll store it tomorrow. Dinner that night was quiet. Later, they sat together on the sofa, half watching TV but too distracted to focus. Eventually, Ellie took Jake's hand and led him to the bedroom. They made love gently, as Jake knew Ellie needed comfort more than passion. He stayed with her that night, sensing that she needed his warmth and presence. The letter had changed how Ellie felt about her sister. She could almost understand why Samantha had acted the way she did, but the affair, which had started before the diagnosis, still confused her. What surprised Ellie most was Samantha's acceptance of her love for Jake, as though Samantha had known about it all along. As they lay in bed, Jake spoke softly, breaking the silence. "Ellie, I think it's time we tell the boys and our parents about us. I love you and want to marry you. Everyone should know." Ellie smiled, touched by his words. "I want that too." Jake kissed her gently. "Jakero will be a new day for us.